Feel better, do better, be better. Experience a better version of you with Mind Alive. Mind Alive Inc. designs and manufactures devices for improving brain performance. By using flashes of light in the eyes and pulses of tones in the ears, these audiovisual entrainment devices gently and safely guide your brain into desired brainwave states. These clinically proven innovative products are used worldwide as a non-pharmaceutical approach to improve relaxation, mental clarity, meditation, increased academic, corporate and sports performance, plus more. Seniors benefit from improved memory, cognition, and balance, which results in fewer falls. Our AVE devices are easy to use. You're on your way to better wellness in as little as 20 to 30 minutes a day.
In this here example of brainwave activity, an EEG in this case, electroencephalograph, we see normal activity. Notice the peak right here. This peak is at 10 hertz in the alpha band. Then we have another peak in the mid-20s and around 22 to 28 hertz in the beta band. This is pretty standard healthy EEG. Notice how the theta and delta is indeed quite low. Now when we look at a head injury, here's a gray matter injury, and gray matter refers to the neurons themselves, as neurons are gray. When we look at white matter, which is networks, as well as, in this case, we're looking at white and gray matter injury. So this is both networks, which have long axons that are covered in myelin, and that's why they are white, because myelin is a sheet of fat. It looks white. But we also have neuronal injury as well. And what we're seeing here, of course, is now high theta, very, very attenuated alpha and beta activity. Now, when we do an EEG, we use this type of an apparatus. We have a headband, as we can see in this picture here, on a person's head, and we pick up all the brain waves at these different sites. And we have frontal site, central, parietal, temporal, motor strip, occipital, prefrontal, and so on, and two ear reference electrodes called A1 and A2. Now, when we look at this here, notice the large delta waves that are showing up in this recording. You can see them there. And notice, though, that otherwise, everything is very flat otherwise. There's really no alpha to speak of, and there's really no beta to speak of as well. And when we process this into a compressed or into a spectral array, as we are here, notice the 1 to 4 hertz there is delta. Theta is in the 5 to 7 hertz range. Alpha is 8 to 12. What's called SMR or beta 1. SMR refers to sensory motor rhythm. And it's over the motor strip at C3 and C4, and it's 12 to 15 hertz. It's the idling rhythm for the motor strip, whereas alpha at 10 hertz is typically the idling rhythm for the rest of the brain, or the main cortex, especially when our eyes are closed. Beta has to do with alertness and mental processing. Now we see in the 23 to roughly the 28 hertz range, there's a little yellow dot there over the left front. That's a little bit of muscle tension that got into the recording, and it shows up too as we get into the gamma band. Now notice the alpha is very attenuated, as well as the beta. They're in deep blue, and the delta is getting quite hot from those low delta waves, those slow delta waves that are going on from both a white and a gray matter injury. Now here's what's interesting. And this is one of the issues with a lot of these head injuries that we're seeing relating to thalamocortical disruptions. Only 15 to 40% of moderate to severe close head injuries show detectable pathology on an MRI. In contrast to MRI, quantitative EEG, which you were just looking at with those colored pictures, it's been shown to be better than 90% accurate in the detection of close head injury. And I think it's more like probably 98, 99%. This was done in 1998 when this study was done. Now in this lecture, I'll be talking primarily about interruptions of thalamocortical loops, and these do not show up on an MRI. Here's what an MRI would look like if you could see a diffuse axonal injury in which the axons of long neurons have been damaged. And so what is a diffuse axonal injury? A diffuse axonal injury is the primary injury that does occur when the head gets shaken quite violently, as you would see in football injuries, car accidents, people falling on sidewalks, any kind of an injury where there's sudden acceleration or deceleration of the skull, and especially if there's a twisting motion involved, it has a tendency to tear the connections between the long axons coming off the neurons and the neurons themselves, or stretches or pulls them, and so on. And this will cause a network disruption because the signals, of course, are not getting through. And this will also cause slowing, which is typically related to the large delta wave activity that we just saw. Now I'm talking about a similar idea, but what we're going to see is going to be unique. What we're going to see doesn't have large delta waves for the most part, but it does certainly show a loss of alpha. Now in this picture here, where the red lines are, you can see they're blocking the signals. When we close our eyes, a loop between it's actually a loop between the thalamus and the neurons of the cortex, which are on the sort of the skin of the brain. There's a loop that is always present, but it's mostly noticeable when we close our eyes or if we're meditating or deeply relaxed. And the neurons aren't busy doing their own thing. Then they send a little relay signal down to the thalamus, and the thalamus basically sends a little loop back, and they have this little communication, as you see in the green lines. And this little communication bounces back and forth at about 10 cycles per second. Now, if a person is thinking about things, this alpha activity is attenuated. So when we make a recording to look for a thalamocortical disconnect, it's very important that the client be extremely relaxed, the room be dark. They're not thinking about things. They're just relaxed and comfortable as possible, which is partly why we use that type of headgear, because that type of headgear, as we saw earlier, is very comfortable to wear and doesn't cause any tension or pain in the scalp from being tight or uncomfortable. Now the brain is filled with networks, as we can see in this picture. They're just everywhere. I mean, when you think about it, most people never really think about just how complex any sensory inputs are. But imagine there's a sound. You hear a sound in the room. Well, immediately when there's a sound, there's signals that go to the amygdala of the brain to see if it's threatening. There's other inputs that go to the nucleus accumbens to see if it's maybe a reward. Attention circuits get woken up, but also it gets run through the olivary body. It gets run through the medial geniculate off the thalami. There's one on each side. It gets run into the auditory centers of the brain and the temporal lobe, primarily the left side. And the frequencies and such get broken down into their different components, and the brain tries to make sense of the sound, and it tries to relate it to other sounds that it knows. Is this a phoneme, a syllable, a vowel? Is it part of a word? Is it the sound of a mouse? Is it the sound of wind? Is it the sound of the ocean? And it tries to connect it with something we already know. In the case of language, it has to then forward it back to the back left side of the brain into Wernicke's area, where it processes this further to make sense with language. And then language gets shot frontally to make contextual observations or valences on it to see what kind of context we're in and how this language might be interpreted given the context of the situation. And so there's a lot going on. And that is just for a few sounds. Well, something about this is now, if we have a little damage to the brain, as we see in the top diagrams there, on the right-hand side, we see the brain with the black blob on one side, and you see the red on the other. Now, this is diaskesis, and diaskesis means to cut from a distance. And in this case, what happens is if there's a brain injury made where that black area is, the area on the right also goes down because those areas are heavily wired from the right to the left. And if the left gets shut down from damage, the right has no one to talk to, and therefore it shuts down as well. Now look at functional diaskesis. So diaskesis while we're doing an activity, and the yellow shows normal. Well, now when we have that same damage done on the left side, Some parts get overexcited and some parts get oversuppressed. As we can see with the green gets overexcited and the red parts get oversuppressed. Connectomal and connectional diaskesis have to do with the networks, and some networks get overexpressed and some networks get basically inhibited. So our behavior in all other parts of our brain and our processing ability can be vastly interrupted. Our personality can change dramatically in parts of the brain that seemingly are far away and have nothing to do with the part of the brain that actually got injured. Now, when we get into this, we also need to know about alpha waves. And because alpha waves are lost during the course of a lot of concussions that are diffuse axonal in nature, but also of a thalamocortical disconnect. Alpha waves are always lost, whether there's a diffuse axonal injury or not. So this here is taken from a database, and what we can see in this picture here, just showing you different sites over the head. FP1, FP2 are in the forehead, FZ, or FZ as Americans call it, and CZ, down the midline, more towards the top of the head. Parietal, PZ, more towards the back center, then O1, O2 are visual centers in the back. And we can see when you look at the alpha-beta ratio in orange, we should have, in an eyes closed condition, 2.5 times frontally and up to 4.6 times, well over 4 times in the parietal occipital areas. In the case of thalamocortical disconnect, we will see that these ratios are typically under 1. Now, neurons, because neurons get a sync pulse from the thalamus, when the thalamus gets disconnected, neurons no longer have a sync pulse, and they will start to fire randomly on their own, which we will see in a moment. So, let's just review a little bit. This type of TBI is not caused by concussions. It's caused by the inflammation and possibly diaskesis issues following a concussion. Many people who've had a closed head injury have been, they stayed at home for a couple of days, they didn't feel so well, and then after 2-3 days they return to work. And they're doing fine at work, and then a month goes by, they're not doing so well. And 2 months goes by, and they're falling to pieces so badly that now they're unemployable. Well, how would the immediate concussion cause those events 2 months down the road? Well, this has a lot to do with fever, inflammation, and another process known as reactive gliosis, in which microglia can be overexcited in the process of repairing the brain, and they cause dysfunction to occur. As we mentioned, these thalamocortical, they're interrupts, they really shouldn't be called injuries, they're not viewable on an MRI, and that's why we don't call them injuries. But during a thalamocortical interrupt, it appears that the brain takes billions of neurons offline as a protective mechanism, possibly, and then forgets they are there. And in some cases, I've seen people completely shut down 25 years later after their head injury. And when the neurons go down, the glia goes down with it. Now, the glia is really important. Glia is the Greek term, or Latin term, for glue. And it's the part of the brain that kind of glues the neurons together. It's the support network for the neurons. And it is made up of astrocytes, microglia, and oligodendrocytes. And if the glia aren't there to nurture and support and feed the neurons will go down as well. So we must have good functioning glia to have good functioning neurons. Now, here's some things now about just that, astrocyte networks. Neurotransmitter glutamate. Now, glutamate is an important neurotransmitter. It's active certainly during levels of cognition. It's very important for being able to think, reason, make executive decisions, process information, and so on. And it triggers calcium ion waves throughout brain tissue, which is picked up in the cytoplasm or the cell structure of astrocytes. And so this suggests that synaptically released glutamate may trigger similar calcium waves in brain astrocytes. In cultured slides of rat hippocampus, and hippocampus is part of the brain that's involved in memory retrieval and storage, astrocytic and neuronal networks are intermingled in their normal tissue relationships. Astrocytic calcium waves are present under these circumstances, and that these waves can be triggered by the firing of glutamate from neurons, or what they call neuronal afferents, or incoming fibers like dendrites into the neurons. And they can do this very quickly in the course of 2 seconds. The ability of tissue astrocyte networks to respond to neuronal network activity suggests that astrocytes may have a much more dynamic and active role in brain function than has generally been recognized in the past. So, astrocytes really rely on, when neurons are firing and they're working, and we're processing information in the day, like right now I'm processing information as I'm giving this lecture, and you're processing information as you're trying to assimilate the meaning of this lecture. And that is releasing calcium in our brain, which astrocytes are sensitive to, and this excites astrocytes to nurture and care for neurons. Calcium is a universal second messenger that regulates the most important activities of all cells. It is of critical importance to neurons as it participates in the transmission of the depolarizing signal. Now, depolarizing signals, all neurons, after they fire, they need to return to a polarized state. And so when they depolarize, that's when they're firing off an action potential. So it participates in the neuron firing, and this contributes to activity of synapses, which are connections in the brain. Neurons have thus developed extensive and intricate calcium signaling pathways to couple the calcium signal to their biochemical machinery. Abnormal neuronal calcium signaling and its involvement in synaptic signaling processes, neuronal energy metabolism, and neurotransmission in the most important neurological disorders must be considered. And a lot of science has neglected to look at this. And so it's becoming something that's emerging in the research now as something we must take a serious look at. And a little more, we're not done. So if the connectome, as we saw, which are the networks in the brain, if they represent a complete map of anatomical and functional connectivity in the brain, where all those signals are bouncing around the brain as they connect information from the different areas, it should also include glia. Glia define and regulate both the brain's anatomical and functional connectivity over a broad range of scales, spanning the whole brain to subcellular domains of synaptic interactions. Glia are important. They're intermingled all over with neurons, and all the neuronal the axons, they're intermingled to the axons so they can myelinate them and so on, which we'll talk about a little more later. So glial interacts with the neuronal connectome, including long-range networks, local circuits, and individual synaptic connections. Our understanding of the structure and function of the neuronal connectome would be incomplete without an understanding of how all types of glia contribute to neuronal connectivity and function. And this stems from single synapses to long-range circuits. Okay, now here's something that's very interesting. Beta waves in the brain have always been attributed to neuronal firing. But what has been recently learned through research is that fast local electrical field oscillations in the beta gamma frequency band from 25 hertz to 80 hertz have been closely correlated with learning, memory, storage, and retrieval, information, attention, and other cognitive functions. But what we didn't know is just how much astrocytes play a role on that frequency band. Astrocytes are well placed to modulate neuronal activity. Astrocytes are necessary for novel object recognition behavior and to maintain functional gamma oscillations both in vitro and in awake behaving animals. So what we're saying here is that astrocytes are responsible for maintaining that frequency band from 25 to 80 hertz. And without the astrocytes, we cannot recognize novel objects that we maybe have not seen before. So in the past, we thought it was strictly the neurons that had to do with recognizing novel objects or other things that are novel, information. And now it's realized that the astrocytes are necessary or it doesn't happen. So they play a vital role in neuronal information or neural information processing and cognition. And here's a picture of astrocytes and such. Take a look at this. Look how it is so intermingled with neurons. Astrocytes are in orange, neurons are in yellow. And the astrocytes are entangled in with the neurons, such as to provide nurturing and signaling and dopamine and glutamate, also norepinephrine, which is brain's adrenaline. One of the things about most TBIs in general is not only do we see delta changes, but we also see delta phase problems. And we see delta phase problems because if those networks get slowed in any fashion, the phase is going to drift in the areas that have been damaged or slowed down. In the case of the thalamocortical disconnect, we really don't see an increase in delta, probably because the networks are not really damaged, but they are disconnected. But they're not damaged, but we see huge delta phase effects with a thalamocortical disconnect. And as mentioned before, when pyramidal neurons are not modulated, such as the thalamic sync pulse, which is where our alpha waves come from, they will fire randomly in the 0.7 to 2.5 hertz range, which is the delta EEG band. If billions of neurons were firing out of phase with each other randomly between 0.7 and 2.5 hertz, they would all wash out through vector addition and we would see a flat line on the EEG. But that's rarely the case. Typically, the EEG is very choppy looking, in high frequency choppy squiggles and things in the EEG record, which we will show you later. And what I propose is what's going on is the rich club networks or nodes are firing. And we can see in this little picture here, the rich club nodes, which are also known as Hagman hubs. These are clusters of neurons that are heavily networked around the brain, and they provide important functions and tasks within the brain. But as clusters of neurons, what I propose is that when one neuron in the cluster fires, it triggers the remaining neurons in that cluster to fire as well. And that's why we see choppiness in the EEG recording, because there could be a little million neurons popping off here and there and everywhere in little clusters. And that gives us the choppy high-speed EEG, because we've got maybe 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 clusters all firing randomly between 0.7 and 2.5 hertz. And that would look very choppy in the record. Here's another picture again of the rich node network, just another picture. Now, we also see huge beta phase effects from this as well. One of the theories that I've got is that, again, imagine now you're at a concert, a band is playing, they're playing a tune, and the tune is 120 beats per minute, which is pretty popular with a lot of rock and roll tunes and stuff. And that equates to 2 hertz, so 2 beats per second. And the band has encouraged the audience to clap with the band. So now the whole audience is clapping at 2 hertz, 2 claps a second. And if you had a microphone in the room, you'd hear this big clap, 2 claps a second. It would be picked up in a microphone in the room. But imagine now, in the audience was broken down into, let's say, a half a dozen sections, which a lot of theaters are. And supposing there is a clap master, a guy in front of each section, and everybody has to clap with him. He represents sort of the master clock of each rich club node. So when everyone's clapping together, which would be kind of like the alpha rhythm, all you pick up is 2 hertz. But when the band stops playing and you applaud the band, now everyone is asynchronous. So none of the sections now are clapping together. So if everyone claps to the guy in front of their section, and those 6 people or 5 people are clapping all asynchronously. Now there's going to be a clackety, big roarish kind of an effect that's going to occur from all this disconnected clapping. And that certainly is one of the theories I'm proposing that could be causing beta phase issues. But that is a big part of a thalamocortical disconnect. There's another theory I'm working on to do with beta phase issues. And this has to do with myelinated nerves. A myelinated axon running across the corpus callosum, which is a bridge that connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere of the brain. If it's a myelinated nerve, that signal can travel across in 30 milliseconds, or 30 thousandths of a second, which is roughly equivalent to about 30 hertz if you saw that on an EEG. Non-myelinated nerves, however, the signals travel 1/10 the speed at 300 milliseconds, and that equates roughly to 3 hertz. Well, oligodendrocytes coat myelin, which is the fat sheath on axons, which is what makes white matter. But they do it only in the presence of electrical activity. Now, if the thalamocortical loop is disconnected and these neurons are sitting idle and they're not showing an alpha rhythm, there is no electrical activity really to speak of that the oligodendrocytes can see, and therefore they may quit coating myelin on these axons. And it doesn't take long for myelin to start to wear off. And I do believe that we're probably seeing this effect, since we have such phase problems in around 25 to 35 hertz. And that's probably conduction velocity slowing down in different networks of the brain. And it takes very little loss of myelin to cause a nerve or an axon, the action potential down an axon, to start to slow. So, what can we do about this? Is there a treatment for this? We need a way to somehow jumpstart this brain that, like I say, it doesn't show up on an MRI. There's really no damage that can be seen in the brain, and yet it is not functioning. And we need a way to jumpstart this brain. Some studies have used needle electrodes at the thalamus, and they've pulsed them at beta wave frequencies, and they've managed to kick the thalamus back into operation. But what's really more exciting is using ultrasonic sound. In these studies here, the one study, of course, if you use anesthesia, it can knock out the loop between the thalamus and the cortex to a degree, general anesthesia. And this group used ultrasonic speakers mounted just around the rat's ears, targeting the thalamus. And when they excited the thalamus with ultrasonic sound, which is inaudible, it reduced the anesthesia time in rats. Another study used a similar thing where they mounted speakers above the ears in a human, and this person quite quickly came out of a coma. Now, this can be done with light, and this is very exciting. Now, this is a recent study that was done. In fact, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to this group, that what the effects of light were on the physiology and the circadian rhythms, and they found that light in itself affects protein in every individual cell in our body. That's how pervasive and important light is. Now, what if you take light and you chop it up into pulses? And in this case, this is what we're doing. For most of our work with exciting the thalamocortical loop, we've been using light flashes in the SMR, sensory motor rhythm range, around 12 to 15 hertz, randomized in the left fields of both eyes, where the B letters would be, as we can see in this example. And we're putting randomized beta on the right side of both fields in around 20 hertz, randomized. And this causes a whole generation of complex latencies and combinations of signals getting basically elicited or stimulated throughout the brain, and of course causes a lot of excitement to neural tissue. This is the device that does it. And we can see here this device called a David Delight has a pair of glasses. We call them eye sets, and there are columns of LEDs mounted in the eye sets meant to stimulate the left and right visual fields of the eyes. There is also headphones with pulsing tones that kind of sound pop, 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 but you get, again, two frequencies at once, and it's very stimulating to the brain. Now, entrainment is very fascinating. The term entrainment means frequency following response, or it means if you stimulate a biological entity or organism with a frequency, and somehow it responds biologically in resonance with that frequency, that term is called entrainment. And audiovisual entrainment implies just that. But in the past, when entrainment was discovered in 1934, they found that you could change the frequency of a light, and you could make the frequency in the brain also change in accordance with the frequency of the light. Later, it was found that tones would do it as well to a lesser degree. But what I have been finding in my 35 years of research with audiovisual entrainment is that the frequency changing aspect of entrainment is the least of what it does. We can see here it dissociates people. It puts them in deep meditative states very, very fast. People going through trauma or anxiety, panic attacks, you can settle them out of it very, very quickly in a meditative kind of way. And when you do so, just like in meditation, the entire body calms right down. We've looked at muscle tension, electrodermal activity, cerebral blood flow, heart rate variability. It all calms down tremendously. Flashing lights, interestingly enough, also increase cerebral blood flow. Many disorders of the brain involve low levels or hypoperfusion of cerebral blood flow. And entrainment increases cerebral blood flow, but it also increases lactate and anaerobic ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Lactate is real important because the brain requires lactate as part of its functioning. In many disorders, including panic disorder, the brain has low levels of lactate, panic and anxiety. Entrainment has been shown. A spinal tap study done by Sheely found that entrainment helps to bring up neurotransmitters that are typically low in psychological disorders such as serotonin, norepinephrine, and endorphins. And it also excites glia as well as neurons. So let's take a look at that. Here's a study by Kinney. And we can see the top trace. These are 2 flashes per second. And we can see that there's 2 pulses showing up. Those are the brain responses to the 2 flashes. At 4 flashes per second, we can see now there's certainly getting to be a rhythm that's starting to occur. The third trace down is at 8 flashes per second, and here we can see that the brain is responding now very well at 8. And very clear entrainment effects from that. 12 is even more clear, and 20 is fairly clear as well at the bottom. There have been several studies done on hypnosis. In fact, entrainment, when it was first becoming popular, most of the research was done on hypnotic induction and hypnosis for general hypnosis, hypnosis for dentistry, hypnosis even for gastrointestinal surgery to reduce pain and reduce the amount of anesthetic that needed to be delivered to the patient during surgery. This here is a hypnosis study done by Kroger and Schneider in 1959, and what we can see here is that within 5 minutes, roughly 78% of all the people who use entrainment are in either a light or a deep hypnotic trance, and most people are in a deep trance compared to a light trance. Other studies on dissociative induction have been done since then at the U of T in Austin. Here's a study looking at heart rate variability. Now, this lady was going through post-traumatic stress relating to an event in her life when her husband was charged with molesting 2 young girls and having explicit child pornography on the computer. And then a judge awarded him alternate weekends to care for her young son and daughter. And her son was 8 and her daughter was 6 years old at the time. And that caused her a lot of distress. Now, in these 2 panels, what we see The left block we see there. This is prior to entrainment, but with a breath pacer. The right block is during entrainment with the same breath pacer. Now on the left side, we can see the green line, and it's all jaggly and what we call spike and clamp activity. That's what a frightened animal produces. When you look to the lower left corner, that's her score, and you can see she has no score at all. When we look to the lower right of the left block, we see her heart rate is at 99 beats per minute. Now we have her breathing in a 10-second breath cycle, or 6 breaths per minute, which is a well-practiced technique for meditation and so on. And if you breathe at 6 breaths per minute, the heart rate should show 6 cycles of speeding up and slowing down, called heart rate variability. It should show that 6 cycles per minute in accordance with the breath. And what it's showing here is her heart is not doing anything that her breathing is doing at all. Despite her trying to calm herself down with a meditative breath, the heart is just going wild with stress. So when we look at the Blue Mountain Range in the upper right corner of the left block, we see how jaggly that is. The low peak at the left side is sympathetic arousal, and the right side is the parasympathetic arousal of the heart as it's trying to balance things out. She should be peaking at 0.1 hertz, which is a 10-second breath cycle, and she's not. And then the lights are turned on and the bump, 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 bump tones are turned on. And very quickly, as we can see on the right-hand block, breathing gets very nice. Large swings in heart rate variability. We can see a little over 2 minutes in. There's a little bit of a glitch when a couple of memories intruded her thoughts. And we can also see her score eroded at the 2 minute, just past 2 minutes in the score panel on the lower left of the right-hand block. But look at her heart rate, slowed down to 77 beats per minute. And this is literally taken within 10 minutes of the first panel. And her entrainment ratio improved tremendously as well. And in the upper right, we see that nice blue peak. That's called a meditator's peak. She still shows a small left peak, which is related to sympathetic arousal, but very, very calm, very fast using entrainment. This is another study here. This is dissociation here. And this study was done at the U of T in Austin. And normally speaking, this group here were people who they had anxiety when they dissociated. They didn't like losing control of things. So these are typically not hypnotizable people. And so they have anxiety when they dissociate. And so they used the entrainment specifically to dissociate them and then measure their anxiety over a 15-minute period. And you can see that their dissociation doubled from 15 to 32, and their anxiety basically doubled from 8.4 to 6. Well, always, whenever a person's anxiety doubles, the heart rate goes up. But look at this study here. Despite their anxiety increasing, their heart rate still was being reduced. The body was still relaxing despite them experiencing anxiety. So it shows how powerful entrainment can be at calming the body down, despite what the brain is going through. Here's some other studies showing autonomic arousal. And we can see here, finger temperature. People under stress often get very cold fingers. And under entrainment, this is at 10 hertz, which is in the alpha band. And about 6 minutes in, as the person dissociates and kind of meditates, the hand really starts to warm up. And that's a sign of, say, being very, very calm and relaxed. The same thing with skin conductance. We have sweaty hands when we're under stress. And this person here is quite under stress. And with entrainment turned on at, again, 10 pulses per second, we see at about the 6-minute mark, the sweat activity really falls off as the person becomes deeply relaxed. And lastly, we show EMG, or electromyograph. This is muscle tension, and this is the person's the forearm of a golfer, actually, who has a lot of tension in his arms and can't golf well. And what we can see here is that, again, at around this 5-6 minute mark, the tension in the arm really starts to fall off as the person meditates out of their fear and their anxiety and gets much calmer. This is Fox and Rakely's study showing different frequencies of flashing lights and how they affect cerebral blood flow. And we can see here actually that at 7.8 hertz, which is in the theta band or theta alpha band, it's kind of on the border, there was maximum increase in cerebral blood flow. They also found the whole brain required a 5% increase in oxygen, meaning we were firing that brain and getting it going, and it needed more oxygen to function just from the stimulation impacting it. This study by Sappi Mariner is a very integral study to explanation of some of the exceptional effects we've been seeing with the audiovisual entrainment, particularly with respect to treating concussion and so on. And this shows lactate increases. And well, lactate is so important in brain function. And in this group here, when the light was turned on, and this is only at 2 hertz, our stuff is using a mix of 14 and 20. And we can see, though, a 260% increase in lactate in the brain after the lights were turned on. And this is say, very exciting research, and it ties in the importance or the ability of audiovisual entrainment to jumpstart the brain. And it's doing some of it through lactate and that effect on astrocytes. So here we go. Astrocytes produce and release lactate as a source of energy for neurons. Lactate serves as an astrocytic signaling molecule in the locus coeruleus. Now, locus coeruleus is a region in the brainstem that is integral to generating norepinephrine, which is brain's adrenaline. And many, many disorders of the mind, the adrenaline in the brain is low. So we can see here that this stimulates brain's adrenaline, and that gets norepinephrine to the frontal brain, and it is one of the most influential modulatory centers of the brain, the locus coeruleus, in terms of waking that brain up so it can be active and it can do things and reason and plan and process information and so on. But there's more. Lactate from astrocytes may be crucial for supporting axonal function as well, especially during times of high metabolic demands or hypoglycemia. The astrocyte neuron lactate transfer shuttle system serves a protective mechanism to ensure a supply of substrates for the brain metabolism, and also for oligodendrocytes. They also appear to influence ability of lactate. And remember, oligodendrocytes are paramount. They're the cells that myelinate the nerves. There is increasing evidence for lactate acting as a signaling molecule in the brain to link metabolism, substrate availability, blood flow, neuronal activity, and for treating panic disorder. And this is an example here of entrainment. This is done by Sheely in 1989, and this was done with a spinal tap. So it was cerebral spinal fluid. It was done near the Chicago area in winter. And melatonin, of course, is part of seasonal affective disorder. When we don't get enough sunlight, melatonin goes up and makes us feel sleepy and sluggish and often kind of depressed, craving carbs a lot. And what we see here is that with entrainment, melatonin drops 6%. But we also see endorphins jumping up 13%. Serotonin jumped up 23%. Now, serotonin deficiency is prevalent in 70% of psychiatric disorders. And here in 30 minutes of 10 hertz stimulation, serotonin was pushed up 23%. Norepinephrine, brain's adrenaline, up 18% within, again, 30-minute span. And as we've been reading here, a low norepinephrine in the brain is certainly an issue with poor brain function. Now, this was really exciting. And this has to do with an Alzheimer's study done in mice. And this is how entrainment can influence the glia directly. In this study, they put a little small electrodes on the heads of Alzheimer's mice and found that their gamma EEG or brainwaves were significantly smaller and less in production than normal mice. So they thought, well, what if we put the Alzheimer's mice in a box and we flashed an LED in there at 40 flashes per second? Would it do anything to their brains? Well, they had a little small mouse MRI set up, And later that day, after they were stimulated for an hour at 40 hertz, they put him in the MRI, and they found that the photic stimulation, or photic entrainment, that's the PE letters you see there, they reduced beta amyloid deposits, which are a big part of Alzheimer's disease, reduced them 58% in the same day. Now, when they looked at microglia, and microglia are, they're kind of scavengers in the brain. They clean up a lot of waste and mess. And they found that the microglia, their cell diameters increased by 166% because they were eating the amyloid deposits. And of course, they found that they were full of amyloid deposits, and that had increased to 90% inside the microglia cell bodies themselves. This is very exciting. Now, psychiatric disorders and OCD following a diffuse axonal TBI. Now, plenty of studies in psychiatry have noticed that obsessive compulsive disorder and generalized anxiety also, but particularly obsessive compulsive disorder, increased dramatically following a diffuse axonal TBI, or traumatic brain injury. I'm also seeing the exact same thing following a thalamocortical disconnect. And here's some of the research. So brain regions involved in OCD. The brain regions involved are the orbital frontal cortex, so above your eyes, basically, and the brain tissue back there. The anterior cingulate cortex, which is right down the middle, from about the top of your head forward, is the anterior and posterior cingulate cortex, and the head of the caudate nucleus. Now, the caudate is a structure deeper in the brain between the cingulate and the thalamus, and that signaling loop in the front goes through both the caudate, the putamen, and the thalamus, and also the cortex. So it has to go through the caudate and the putamen to get to the thalamus. So if we see abnormal brain waves, especially on an alpha that's very slow and really shows up down the center, it's likely implicating the caudate as well as the cingulate also. So we're seeing it implicating both structures at once in that brainwave rhythm. When we have a thalamocortical disconnect, we lose reasoning, we lose executive functioning, we lose ability to control our emotions, process information. And if we lose those cognitive abilities and we lose emotional control, anything can happen. There's a whole spectrum of disorders associated with a thalamocortical dropout or disconnect. Could there be millions of people who are suffering and are falling through the cracks? And I think there are. I think because medicine doesn't understand what this disorder is about. And that's why I'm presenting this. Now, I'm going to show you obsessive compulsive disorder of a 54-year-old female who's a hoarder. And this is normal OCD. This is not thalamocortical disconnected OCD. But we can see here in this record is there's alpha waves throughout. Those are those nice big squiggly lines. And they look really good. So this person has normal OCD. Her networks are intact because we see the thalamocortical loop is working because we see these alpha waves present in the record. Now, when we take a look at it though, you'll see at 9 hertz, the dominant activity in an eyes closed condition is down the middle and down the cingulate. The back one, there's near the back is also a little precuneus and a little bit of the occipital on the right-hand side. But a lot of it's also affecting more frontal, down the center, and that's the cingulate and probably the caudate. And it's also slowed at 9 hertz. And that's another sign of OCD. Typically, it's slowed as well. On a database, we can see on the database itself, I should just back you up a little bit here. Take a look at this again. This is on a microvolt scale. So this is Fourier analysis, just breaking everything down into frequency components. And we're seeing that the peak is down the center of that cingulate, and it shouldn't be there. It should be in the right parietal, which is further back on the right-hand side. On the database itself, though, what we see is the prefrontal areas, are not functioning well. They're slowed down. And we also see there's a little depression showing up as well at F3, which is the left frontal area at 9 hertz. When we look at the phase, look at the phase. We always see a mess with phase whenever we look at OCD, whether it's normal OCD or whether it's caused by the thalamocortical disconnect. And you can see here what we're looking at. We have blue areas and we have hot pink areas. What this means is between the blue areas and the pink areas, there's a dramatic change in one direction of the signals going one way, and they're faster going the other way. And so there's damage in one direction. And often there's a fair bit of left-right stuff that shows up, and we certainly see this happening between O2. We can see O2 has definitely got a problem. That's the right visual cortex, and it has certainly a problem with the whole remainder of the brain with its damage, and the networks going to that area. But F7, which is a lot to do with speech and to a lesser degree happiness, has also got some issues, as well as the right temporal lobe. So some dramatic issues going on here in the delta phase measure. Okay, and that's a fairly normal OCD. Now we're going to take a look here at a person who's a tapper. He has to tap everything just right or he can't move on. And sometimes he has to tap for as long as 15 minutes before he can get himself away from it. Somehow he kind of believes it might give him good luck too when he gets his taps right. Not that I would think it does. And we can see he also has OCD. However, he has no history of a closed head injury or traumatic brain injury. But he shows like someone who does. And this is most likely the result of a viral infection that he had some years prior to. So take a look here at his activity. It's very flat and choppy. I see a little bit of delta activity getting in there in some spots. On the right-hand side, more so we see it. But mostly it's fairly choppy. Now, when we process it on the microvolt scale, first of all, what we notice is that he's at 1.7 microvolts, which is very low. And it is. He has very low activity. But we're also seeing very slow activity with a focus at 6 hertz right down the middle, which is the cingulate area. And that's tied to his tapping problem. Now, when we look at the this is processed now in a database, so it's z-scored. We see he has dropped out at alpha. He has really no alpha to speak of. Everything else is pretty good. So unlike the gray matter, white matter type of injury, where you'd also see beta really dropped out and you'd see high theta in the 2, 3, 4 hertz range on the database, he mostly shows an alpha dropout. Thalamocortical loop is disconnected. On the entropy measure, it's really apparent, the dropout, and you can't miss it. Now, here's his phase. Look at the phase issues we have. Again, delta phase issues. Okay, here's a counter. Now, this person, you can see here, does have some larger squiggles and things throughout his record. He is certainly producing some alpha. At around the 58 second mark, 57 to 58, we see some slowed activity in those wavelets. They're rather slowed down, and but he has some network functioning going on with the thalamocortical loop. But we can again see 4 hertz. If we zoomed in a little tighter, we'd see 5 and 6 hertz too. 7 we see already, with a center down the a focus down the center of the brain in the cingulate area, and that's tied to his issues with counting. Now we see in this case, though, however, we do see a fair bit of a beta dropout, so there could also perhaps be some brain damage going on there as well. Look at the phase problems, left-right, and we have a tendency to see the phase problems be more left-right side. So networks in one direction certainly are very slowed. Again, no history of a head injury. Okay, now we're going to take a look at a much more documented case here of a client who received entrainment off of David Delight's system. 18-year-old female, no history of a traumatic brain injury or close head injury. Had a flu-related fever, however, a few years earlier. Later on became anxious and obsessive, struggles with anorexia, has high interpersonal anxiety, gets very poor sleep, gets about 5 hours per night. And this is always the case. Whenever a person loses their alpha wave, alpha typically, not only does it synchronize the signals in our brain so everything can communicate synchronized, like a drummer in a band, everybody plays well if they follow the drummer. But with the loss of alpha, anxiety goes up, especially the obsessive compulsive type, and sleep impairments are rampant. Every single person with an alpha loss has a sleep disorder. And when we look at her brain waves here, we see a lot of it is very choppy again. She does show a little bit of a rhythm at the 5 minutes and roughly 1 second to 2 seconds. There is a little bit of stuff that goes on, but it's mostly clamped out throughout most of her recording. And this is the microvolt scale, and bingo, look what we see down the middle. Yeah, we see slow activity following down the cingulate primarily. On the database, we see the alpha is lost at 10 hertz. That's where it should be. That's where it's particularly low. Her phase actually overly wasn't too bad. We still see some phase issues, but they were better than we would expect. But her beta phase, that's another story. This has to do with reasoning. Well, a lot of people with anorexia don't reason well. And we can see the beta phase is a real mess. All parts of the brain are disconnected from each other. Put her on entrainment and flashing the lights now. We're using 10 hertz on one side, on the left side, and randomized 20 hertz on the right-hand side. And we see within about 15 minutes, suddenly she starts producing huge alpha spindles. The networks got fired up. But in the process of producing big alpha spindles, typically they fall asleep right in the chair with the cap on and the lights going. And this young lady did just that too. And we can see she's showing some big delta waves. She has some just before 12:23, a big delta spike there, but she also shows them at 12:26. And further on again in the record at just past 12:28 a bit there, we see some. Maybe a little bit past 12 minutes and 30 seconds, and intermixed with alpha spindles. And this happens most of the time when we put people on entrainment. They fall asleep, but we fire up the thalamocortical loop at the same time, so their brain kind of bounces back and forth between large delta sleep-related waves and alpha. Here she is in the chair, fast asleep. And when we look at the database now, her alpha actually was running fast. And sometimes that occurs. We don't know why. It does slow down over time, over the next couple of weeks, and gets more normal towards 10. But take a look at the difference now. Look how green that is. 0 standard deviations is perfect. And that's a greenish yellow color. Let me take you back a few slides here and take a look at this again. This is what she was before. A lot of cortical shutdown, or shutdown with reasoning and processing information, making intellectual decisions, kind of shut down in those blue areas. And here it is fired right up. Plus her brain is particularly fast at the moment. Phase, still has some phase issues. Sometimes they stand out more after entrainment because parts of the brain will kick back in and they'll start firing. And other parts then look like they have a bigger phase issue because other parts are functioning better. But this is her not long after. She put on weight. Her anxiety is gone. She slept 10 hours the first night. And she's been sleeping 8 hours a night ever since. This is called an SCL-90R, or Symptom Checklist 90R. There's 90 questions. And you can see it measures these different scales. One thing is, look at her raw score, 77 at intake. 3 weeks later, her raw score is 5, which is so low. The average, the norm, is 50. So she started off high, and you can see somatization, thinking about body issues is a high score. Obsessive compulsiveness, of course, is a high score. Interpersonal sensitivity, what others think of her, is a higher score. Anxiety is a higher score. And 3 weeks later, it's non-existent. She's completely calm and relaxed and getting on with her life. Now, this is a lady who's 5 years post motor vehicle accident. And one of the things is that with the lawyers, they were litigating against the motorist who had hit her. And she was supposed to write a victim impact statement, and it had been most of a year now, and she still hadn't written a title. After 3 weeks of entrainment using SMR beta, she wrote a 15-page report. So very impressive how her brain kicked back into service. And we can see here some of the things she reported. Difficulty remembering things, focusing and concentrating, reading. I could not easily distinguish between right and left, and I had balance issues. I was also having strange things happening with my vision, where there was a delay in seeing things. Because of my disabilities, I was unable to work, and that causes stress too. I mean, when now people have money issues, right? And that causes a great deal of stress and interferes with sleep when you cannot pay the rent or pay the mortgage or buy groceries. And what we find and what we believe is that the more psychiatric disorders a person has, the more they struggle financially because they can't work and they can't budget their money well. And also, say, as obsessive compulsive people, they may spend money recklessly at times as well. And these are all factors, but they certainly do struggle with money. So a technique that is very low cost, easy to implement, and can be used at home and empowers the client to heal themselves is the best approach you could ever imagine for people in these situations. Anyway, back on track here. She also had issues bumping into everything and dropping things. She had poor sleep, which everyone has, and very focused on pain issues with her body, which resolved completely a few weeks after entrainment. A lot of her pain was because of the fact that she was obsessing on it. Now, look at her record here again. Again, very low voltage, choppy looking stuff. T3 and T4 have a little bit of muscle that got in, and she's blinking her eyes a lot. She can't seem to stop this tick that's in her eye that's related to anxiety. It's an anxiety tick. And you can see it on the top records, FP1, FP2, F7, F8, and these little ticks are showing up from her eyes ticking away. Look at her now on the raw scale again, and look at 1.75 microvolts, again, very low voltage. And guess what? 5, 6, 7 hertz, even 4 if we zoom out a little. This is all slow activity, and the locus or the center point is down the cingulate, and that's her OCD. On the database, and so now she's being z-scored against the normal population, we see that her alpha, again, is dropped out. She has next to no alpha to speak of, and that's why 10 hertz is so blue. The database is looking for that. Here's her phase. More left-right issues, which is more typical what we see. Some front-back stuff too, but more left-right. This is her beta phase, again, which has to do with cognition. And look how that's hammered out. It's really pounded out bad. A lot of issues, again, more to do with left, rear, right side, and right side. The signals are very slowed in one direction. This here is roughly at about the 18-minute mark of entrainment. Although the recording, this segment of recording, I had restarted recording again. And this is one little over a minute into the recording where I took this sample, but I started this at about 15, 16 minutes in. And so roughly at 18 minutes, she's starting to show big, beautiful alpha spindles. And they're in the parietal area where they belong. That's where they should be. Not everybody always starts off that way. It kind of depends where their injuries are. But this is starting off really nice in the right area. And look at this now. This is now on the microvolt scale again. Beautiful peak at 10. That's what we want to see. And it's more in the parietal area on the back. A little bit in the occipital, but beautiful. Now take a look at it again, a few slides back. Look, she's all dropped out here. So that's where we like to see it. And she's doing much better. Some of the entrainment at 20 hertz or so got into the record, and that's okay. And we don't mind that. A little of the SMR got in at 14 hertz as well. But her brain is much more smooth and normal than it was before. Phase improved tremendously. Remember the phase? Now, that's what the phase, what we saw there. And I don't know if I can always explain why the phase is doing so well, except that if we get the drummer going again, which is the alpha rhythm, it might be removing that randomized delta activity that's coming off of the Rich Club network. This is what she said when the session was over. This was on a Friday when we did the brain map and the entrainment. And she said she was clear-headed, sharp, really doing well till about mid-Sunday. Then she started fogging back up again. So her brain started regressing back into the injured way of operating. So we got her back in the next week and sent her home with an audiovisual entrainment unit, the David Delight, and gave her an SMR beta protocol. She got a little too wound up on that protocol, she found, so later we put her on the brain brightening protocol, which is a protocol we use more with seniors with cognitive decline. And we've had some very good research on that. And that's what she liked best. Now, this is the SCL90 form again, but I didn't process it this time because I wanted you to see the actual issues she was having specific troubles with. And you'll always will see it's cognitive and it's emotional. So what is really highlighted here? What's really standing out? Trouble remembering things. Memory, cognitive, and emotional. High in feeling blocked and getting things done. High, having to do things very slowly to ensure correctness. Difficulty making decisions. Mind going blank. Trouble concentrating. Heavy feelings in her arms and legs, and that's pretty common. Awakening in the early morning. Well, they all have sleep disorders, so that's what they do. And so her score was a 72. This is her 3 weeks after using entrainment. Now her score is a 10. She has practically no issues to speak of at all. A little bit of trouble remembering things still, but it's still down from what it was. Here's the previous, prior to treatment, and here's 3 weeks later. Dramatic increases. In fact, she has gone to work and has a full-time job now and is doing very well.